Hey everyone, welcome back to Frosty's Abronias, a channel dedicated to all things Abronia. Today we're going to go over the things I'd do differently with Abronia care if I did it again. It's going to be mainly 5 topics, broken down into some subpoints, but generally just going over what I would do differently if I started all over again. Number 1, I would definitely go with a different style of enclosure. I wouldn't go with these PVC enclosures that I got from Reptile Habitats. There was a lot of issues I had when setting these up. I'll show some behind the scene footage of me building some of these while I'm talking about it. But the biggest struggle I had with these is quote unquote waterproofing them, which took a substantial amount of time to get them waterproofed. And in the future, I would probably go with, instead of a PVC enclosure, go with a mesh enclosure. The reason why is mesh enclosures offer better airflow. These guys come from the cloud forests where they have abundance of constant moving air. The air is constantly moving in and rolling in and out. While it's still high humidity, the airflow is amazing. And I had to do some crazy modifications to these to get airflow in here. I had to add fans all over the place, and I had to do some tinkering to get the airflow and the humidity exactly where I wanted it to be. There is a couple ways to do this with a PVC enclosure, or make a PVC enclosure, what I would call a hybrid enclosure or a hybrid hack, where you take a mesh enclosure like the Recti Breezes, and you take polywall, which you can get at your Home Depot. You might be able to get it a couple other places, but it's thin plastic material. And you take hole punches and you hole punch it right where the screws go into the Recti Breeze. This is brought to you by a different content creator. I'll put his link down below. But he came up with this idea. He showed it on his channel. I think it's a great idea, and definitely what I'd be doing in the future with these is taking a mesh enclosure and adding some sort of polywall or other plastic material to insulate it more, to keep that humidity higher, but get the benefits of a mesh enclosure of the high air movement. Another thing with having a mesh enclosure is, since they do have claws and not sticky pads like geckos do, they're able to actually claw into that mesh. With these enclosures, I put cork bark along the sides, backs, and edges so that they could claw in and climb and use those sides. But if I went with a mesh enclosure, I could still use the cork, but allow them to use the mesh as well. Another big benefit to the mesh enclosures is they're oftentimes cheaper than the PVC alternatives. And with that polywall hack that I'm talking about, you can buy a big sheet of it for relatively cheap and convert it into a hybrid enclosure. So in the future, I would definitely go with a completely different style of enclosure. Now, PVC, as you can see here, and I know other people use them as well, work perfectly fine. But when it comes to cost efficiency and ability to give them that true airflow, I think nothing beats mesh, and I think I will be going with that in the future. Number 2, a dedicated room. Right now, these are in the same room as my office and my bedroom, which is due to my living situation, but one of the big things with having a dedicated room for them was you were able to control humidity and temperature better. And especially when you have a mesh enclosure, instead of trying to min-max the enclosure itself, you min-max the room, and then you make sure you have high airflow with like a fan running or an AC keeping them cool to keep the entire room a constant temperature. This way you can control the humidity spikes, you can control the temperature spikes, and you don't have to worry so much about the individual enclosures and how they're set up. Another thing with a dedicated room is, if you've ever kept a Abronia, you'll know this very well in the same room as you, is they like it really cold. So that means if you're living in the same room as them, it gets cold at night, very cold. We're talking 50s, and in the winter, if you're brewmating them, even low 50s, high 40s, and that can get very cold to sleep in. Now, granted, during the nighttime, I do like sleeping in colder rooms, but when it hits the 50s, you're bundled up in multiple jackets and sweatpants and trying to stay warm. And let me tell you, it is not fun. Number 3, I would use a sphagnum moss substrate. Now, these are bioactive enclosures, so there is sphagnum moss in the substrate. And I have a full drainage layer, I have charcoal down there, and I have a bioactive substrate, but these guys seem to like to burrow. And when I say burrow, I don't mean like tunneling and stuff like that, but they like to nestle down into sphagnum moss. And that's why I stuff sphagnum moss in different cork rounds and have a huge pile of it on the ground. They like to burrow into it, they like to shed in it, and they like to enjoy that cool. And I know a lot of people have had experiences when they brewmate their Abronia, they'll actually nestle down into there. And the reason I would do that is, one, it's also more cost effective. Two, you can still somewhat make it bioactive. If you want plants growing, what I would do and what I plan on doing is having a deep, deep layer of sphagnum moss, but then having potted plants using, a bioactive substrate that is still reptile safe and still doesn't have all that vermiculite and other stuff that can cause impactions, but having those in pots to allow them to grow up, but have a deep layer of sphagnum moss that they can really go in. And this would help if you're using a mesh enclosure with having that water leak out everywhere. If you've ever used a PVC enclosure or a glass enclosure and you have a misting system in there, you've experienced not having a deep enough drainage layer before, that water can build up. But with the sphagnum moss, it'll absorb a lot of that. Even if you soak it, you're able to still have it constantly keep that nice moist substrate. And it's also somewhere they can go and get chilled. So if they want to go down in there, they can get a ton of humidity, cool down a bit, and then come back out when they want. The sphagnum moss substrate also allows for cleaning. You are able to take it out and replace it with new sphagnum moss. So if you're worried about it getting gunky or stale and stuff like that, you can remove it. Another issue I had with these guys is I've had to replace the isopods in these multiple times now, because they actually will go to the bottoms and scurry and look for isopods and eat them. So I've had a real hard time keeping isopods alive in here. Even giving them plenty of cork to hide under and plenty of areas to hide, they still seem to disappear. I have physically seen them track down isopods and eat them. And it really hurts the soul when they're definitely not just powdered oranges. Moving on to number 4, it would be plant choice / enclosure layout. The reason I'm combining these two is they kind of go hand in hand. I would have definitely gone for more native plants. I have some plants in here like the pothos and the monstera, which isn't doing the greatest, and other plants like that, which aren't as native and common in their natural habitat. I would definitely go with a lot more mosses, a lot more bromeliads, a lot more orchids. I don't really have any orchids in here, and definitely more ferns. Orchids and ferns are the big two that I don't think I have enough in these enclosures, and I hope to bring some to their enclosures at some point, but I gotta quarantine those plants currently, and I have to wait for those to go through their cycling before I introduce them, because I don't want to introduce any pests and stuff like that. But I would definitely go with a lot more native plants and a lot more plants entirely. I think these are pretty heavily planted, but I don't think they're planted enough. They like to roam through the plants, especially the Spanish moss, which if you get Abronia, get a lot of Spanish moss. They'll hide in it. I've seen them dangle in it, and I see mine hanging out in them all the time. They love that. Add that. It's a definite win of a plant for Abronia. Secondly, the layout with these, I don't know if you can tell, and I'll show some of the behind the scene footage of me building these more here, is a lot of it is centered around the center of the enclosure. So I have big cork tubes around the centers, and what this causes is, if you look down at the bottom, some of the plants haven't done so well near the bottom due to the fact that they can't get lighting. Due to it being a tall enclosure, the lighting, doesn't always get to the bottom. And what I would do in the future is have more cork branches in the center and have the cork logs span the outsides. So you would have this tunneling effect where you would have the center be branches and diverse light, still letting light through, but you could still have plants grow on those branches and stuff like that, but you'd have more of a column of light that comes down, and the cork rounds giving you those hidey holes along the backs and the sides of the enclosure, still allowing that hiding areas, still allowing for that different elevation in temperature and humidity throughout the enclosure that they can go into, but it allows more plant growth throughout the entire enclosure. That way, if you have plants near the bottom or in the substrate, it allows them to grow. Because what I found is there's a lot of spots in these enclosures, even if I have low light plants, that just don't get enough light to grow sufficiently. So that would be a huge change I would make, is the layout and the plants I used in this enclosure. Number 5 is acquiring my Abronia. I would definitely go about this a little differently than I did. One of the big things was that the paperwork and the effort I went through to get these was pretty high. I went through a full FOIA request with the importation documents for these guys, and I might make a whole video explaining that process, because that was a 9-month process just to get the legal documentation for these guys. And because it is time consuming and a lot of effort. But the big thing with acquiring the Abronia is you want to make sure that they're captive bred from ethical sources. That's a huge deal with these guys. And now that I've, talked to a bunch of people, now I've worked with a lot of people in the community, I have a lot of different sources of people who are ethically breeding these, who I know personally on a different level than I did before when I first got on this journey. And I have a better understanding of how they're caring for them. I have more of a one-on-one conversation with these breeders, and I would definitely go with them in the future just to keep building that network and keep, making sure that, everything's up to par and the level of care that they're getting before I get them is up there. Because that's a huge thing, like when I got these guys, I vetted them through getting them a bunch of vet checks, making sure that they had no parasites. And they did have some small ones, but nothing too concerning, and they're all checked out and good and healthy now. But this way I know, exactly where they're coming from, who they're from, how they raise them, how are they bred, making sure everything's up to par. That's just a huge thing with these guys. If you're looking to acquire a Abronia, I'm definitely going to be making a video on how to go about ethically and safely acquiring a Abronia. There's a lot of breeders out there who say that their Abronia is captive bred when they're actually imports or potentially illegally smuggled animals. I don't want you or anyone out there to accidentally, source a unethical Abronia that hurts their native population. We don't want to do that. We want to see these animals thrive. They're such an amazing species, and I want to see them do well in captivity and in the wild, especially making sure those populations stay up, because most of them, if not all of them, are pretty much critically endangered. If they're all endangered in some capacity due to, the illegal animal trade, deforestation, and a bunch of other reasons. So just keeping that in mind, we got to make sure the way we acquire these guys is up to par. And I would definitely go about it slightly differently than I did before. Hope you guys enjoyed that video. That was the 5 things I would do differently if I were to start over again with my Abronia. I hope you learned something from this, and maybe you take something away from this and are able to incorporate it in how you go about getting your Abronia so you don't make the same mistakes I did, or at least you learn something about Abronia in general. If you guys have any questions or anything you guys want to see, feel free to leave a comment down below. Check out the Discord where you can get tons of information about help. Check out my Instagram where I'm constantly posting pictures and videos about these little guys. It's an awesome source, so feel free to check that out. Don't forget to hit the like button, the subscribe button. If you can hit that notification bell, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you for stopping by and learning a little bit more about these. I hope to see you guys in the next video. Peace.